Okay, so you have 8 minutes. The timer is here. I will let you go.
Fantastic. I will sit down just for this so I can actually read what I've said here. But yeah, so I'm James. I have 2 weeks left of being a research associate at the University of Sheffield, and then I'm going to Umeå, which I keep getting the Umeå in Sweden. So this was first the battle of the Northerners, and now it is Norway versus Sweden. But yeah, so before I begin, and defend the motion that most cases, it says depression up there, but we sort of originally agreed major depressive disorder are functional signals. I should note that I am a philosopher, and as such, I'm going to begin by defining a couple of terms. So here we go. Firstly, what do I mean by depression or major depressive disorder? So I'm just going to use the term depression or MDD for expedience's sake. But when I do, I mean the condition that is picked out by the DSM-5-TR. So that's to say you have 5 low mood symptoms that last for 2 or more weeks and they get in the way of your everyday life. I'm not talking about depressive episodes that occur in, say, bipolar disorder. Now, secondly, when I say that depression is functional or is a functional signal, I don't mean that depression is pleasant or something that we should strive to experience or even something that is actually adaptive in most circumstances. Rather, I mean that depression is the output of a psychological system or systems that are performing the function they were selected for by natural selection. So it's the classic definition of proper function in philosophy, and I think a lot of evolutionary theory as well. So basically, my claim is that most cases of depression, people's psychological systems are functioning according to their design, or more scientifically, they're functioning in the way they functioned in the ancestral past, such that they were selected for. So now, on to the argument for this. Now, remember, my claim is that most cases of depression are functional. This does not preclude that some cases of depression are dysfunctional. Of course they are. Any system that exists can become dysfunctional. But I think these arguments give us reason to think that around 80% or so cases of depression are functional. And just to remind you, I only need 51% of cases to win this debate. In fact, I need 50.1 or 001. You know how maths works. So first, depression is extremely common. An estimated 330 million people meet the formal criteria for MDD at any one time. That's around 4% of the world's population. Now, it seems unlikely that so many people would suffer from a psychological dysfunction, so a psychological system that is not doing what it is, again, supposed to do according to natural selection, with no clear pathogen or brain damage to cause this. For reference, a condition like schizophrenia, which seems far more paradigmatically dysfunctional, is more than 10 times less common. Secondly, as Adam sort of alluded to at the beginning there, depression is most prevalent in early reproductive age. This, again, is unlike the vast majority of dysfunctions, which become more prevalent with age as our brains and bodies begin to deteriorate. You've probably heard too before, they're fairly common things that are brought up. But so in my work, and I think this is something that's hopefully somewhat new to people, I focus on the relationship between depression and mild low mood, and I think this actually gives us the best reason to think that most cases of depression are not dysfunctional. So almost everyone agrees that mild low mood is a functional signal. It's universal across cultures, arises during fitness-impacting circumstances like falling out with friends or failing to complete a personal goal. It's seen in many species of non-human animals, and many of its effects, such as demotivating behavior, are fitness-enhancing, as shown by multiple computational models and studies into how blocked low mood is detrimental to fitness in both humans and animals. We can talk more about that later. Now, depression and mild low mood are distinguished based on their severity and duration of core symptoms, as I mentioned at the beginning. If you experience fewer than 5 low mood symptoms for less than 2 weeks, you have mild low mood. There's different names for it. Some just say subclinical depression or just low mood. But to help distinguish, I'll say depression and mild low mood. More than this, and you have depression, major depressive disorder. But severity and duration alone are poor indicators of dysfunction. Take pain, for example. Pain can be mild and fleeting, such as when you stub your toe, or it can be severe and last for weeks, such as when one breaks a bone and fails to repair it. But if I've broken my leg and I don't get it fixed, then there is nothing dysfunctional about my extreme, long-lasting pain. Fine, there's a dysfunction in my leg, but the pain is a functional signal that indicates severe, long-lasting damage. Why then should the same logic not apply to mild low mood and depression, given that they are diagnosed based on severity and duration alone? If mild low mood is a functional signal, why should extreme low mood not likewise be a functional signal? Now you might say, well, the diagnosis isn't the whole story. Depression has, you might think, different effects compared to low mood outside of these core symptoms. This, however, isn't really true. Low mood has a wide range of effects on behavior and cognition. It globally demotivates behavior, makes people more pessimistic, and makes people attend to and remember more negative stimuli. When we look at the reliable effects of depression on behavior and cognition, we see exactly the same thing, differing only in severity. So global demotivation of behavior, more pessimism, attending to and remembering more negative stimuli and memories. Again, this really is looking like the mild versus severe pain example. Same effects, different intensities, both functional. Now, perhaps you're thinking, as some have claimed, that what makes the difference here are the causes. Even if the DSM ignores causes, isn't it the case that mild low mood is caused by failures, losses, cold and dark weather, illness, whereas depression appears without cause? No, that's not correct either. While it is true that mild low mood does arise after those events, so do most cases of depression. Around 80%, in fact, of cases of depression arise following severe negative life events, such as job losses, divorce, and bankruptcy, i.e. major failures and losses. More still follow from long spells of cold, dark weather, such as in seasonal depression, and yet others arise after chronic or severe illness or injury, such as heart attacks. And yet you might still argue, fine, most cases of depression have identifiable causes, and yes, severity and duration alone are not good indicators of dysfunction. But nonetheless, the effects of depression are too severe given their causes. This, I argue, does not hold up to scrutiny. Remember, 80% of cases of depression are caused by severe negative life events. You're talking divorces, job losses, deaths of family members. What's more, to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder, these symptoms only have to last for 2 weeks, and you have to show 5 of these symptoms. All of these events will usually have serious deleterious effects for more than 2 weeks. Job loss being a very obvious example, as is divorce, and even the death of a family member. If that affects you for more than 2 weeks, I don't think that's particularly dysfunctional. Even when depression is caused by illness, it's usually serious illness, things like heart attacks or chronic illnesses, again, which last for far more than 2 weeks. And the cold and dark weather that cause depression are seasonal cold and dark weather, which last for months. What's more, there's no quantum leap, running out of time, as it were, in the severity of the effects between depression and mild low mood. It's not the case that mild low mood demotivates behavior and depression causes people to be totally catatonic. Rather, mild low mood demotivates behavior and depression demotivates behavior to a greater extent, with only the most severe and very rare cases of depression causing people to be totally catatonic. Once again, sounds like mild versus severe pain. So to sum up, depression is common, appears at a time that indicates that it is not a dysfunction, and shares the same causes and effects as mild low mood, a functional signal. It differs in severity and duration, but this can be explained by the kinds of events that precipitate it. Thus, most cases of depression seem to be to mild low mood what severe but normal pain is to mild but normal pain. Functional signals all around. That's terrifying.
Okay, thank you for that opening statement. I realise, I should have said you can introduce yourself before the clock. I didn't give you that. You introduced yourself 15 seconds, so you were actually perfectly on time. Leif, please introduce yourself quickly.
So I hate introducing myself, but my name is Leif Edward Ottesen Kennair. I'm a psychologist, clinical psychologist from Norway, professor of personality psychology, but I do most of my research into sex and anxiety, not at the same time. People have tried both at the same time, not neither here nor there. So most of my research I do on sexual behaviors from an evolutionary perspective, sexual strategies theory being the most typical predictive theory I use. But I also do clinical research as a protocol therapist in different studies. I should have told the tape too. But you've got it so many times now on tape. Yeah. So I think that's the short version. Yeah. Is that fair enough?
That's fine.
Okay.
Are you ready?
I'm sort of ready. All right. So 80% of depression is caused by negative life events, it's claimed, but that's not even true. That's an interesting little mix-up because it's 80% of people who are depressed are so because of events for their first or second episode, But most of the depression in the world is recurrent or chronic and is therefore not elicited by anything that is observable. So one of our major problems here is that I do agree with James when it comes to considering low mood in general. I think he's got it all right when he's talking about the foundational underpinnings of the disorder, the functional aspects, the human nature aspect of sadness and low mood in general. Dimensionally, there's something missing though. At some point we have a discontinuation, a qualitative change where the disorder becomes something else than just a continuation of pain. I come at this from the perspective of the clinician. So I see patients and I treat patients with depressive disorder. We use different therapies. Throughout my career, I've been using behavioral activation, we've been using cognitive therapy, but most of our recent research is on metacognitive therapy. So we have patients who are ruminating, or that, to be more precise, brooding. And they're brooding, and they believe it's helpful, and they believe it's impossible to control. And they continue with this, in some cases for more than 2 years. And the cost of this worldwide makes this one of the most expensive disorders in medicine. It costs families, it costs the children of mothers who are depressed. It reduces psychosocial adaptation across age, both prospectively and in recall. And there is no evidence that being depressed makes you better fitted for life in any way. There's an increase in other disorders. There's 50% overlap comorbidity with generalized anxiety disorder. It's much the same genetic background. It matches high neuroticism. And all in all, when we treat people, discontinue their brooding, we find that they return to work, they return to studies, and they have an increased quality of life. And also that the effect of the treatment prevents relapse even after negative life events. So from my perspective as the clinician, I would say we simply know that it causes harm, both bodily, mentally, socially. It causes it in generations, and it causes it in society. And we can treat it, and we can provide patients with solutions. And that's maybe why this makes it important to me. I fear that some of our colleagues step into the little trap of the shibboleth of faith. We need to convince our co-evolutionists in our little team that we are the right believers. But there we step into the trap of panselectionism. We are not panselectionists. We don't need to, as evolutionists, to believe that everything under the sun is adaptive. Actually, sometimes when the just so story is being presented to us, it is our damned responsibility to test it critically, not just accept it to be part of the in-group. The other thing is, by presenting to patients the idea that their brooding is indeed adaptive, we run the risk of inducing, prolonging, dissuading people from seeking therapy and living poorer lives and costing both their families and themselves and society more than if we could convince them that this is a treatable disorder that we efficiently can do something about. Now, my background is mostly as an anxiety treater, and we treat anxiety because we know the function of fear. One of the biggest mysteries in our field is the function of sadness. There's no one in this room, I think, who knows what the function of sadness actually is. And that's also one of the missing pieces of this debate. What is it that it's functionally achieving? Because depression is functionally not achieving anything in the current atmosphere, but has it achieved something previously? In one of our studies, 1,200 Scandinavian well-off, safe teenagers confirmed the model that brooding, negative metacognitions are the major predictors of depressive symptoms, but they are doing fine. People like Paul loves running around in the woods. Joggers, they have better depressive scores, not worse. But surely that wasted effort should have made them pretty depressed, because after running around in the woods, you're back home after exerted energy and not achieved anything. It's odd. Why isn't that a cause of depression given the current model, James? If we knew the function of sadness, maybe we could discuss this more precisely. If we knew the function of sadness, maybe we could treat depression more efficiently. We know the function of fear. We know it motivates us to perform species-specific defense responses, either get out of harm's way or defend ourselves against the harm. We understand, therefore, every anxiety disorder. Each one of them in the big book of diagnosis has a set of things that people fear, things they do to avoid this fear, and things that they therefore maintain their disorder with. In depression, rumination, or specifically brooding, is what the person does, and that's what contains their or maintains their disorder. Discontinuing this does not have any detrimental effect on their life quality. Actually, it improves it. Doesn't have any detrimental effect on their work or study ability. Actually, it improves it. And doesn't have any detrimental effect on them functioning, social or otherwise. Actually, it improves it. So my conclusion is it is obviously a dysfunction. As has been said, any system can dysfunction. Suggesting that it cannot be a dysfunction because it looks like something else is not a good argument.
Okay. Thank you. This is good. This is nice and combative. I want polar opposites.
So friendly, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so James, you have a 4-minute rebuttal to Leif's point.
Super. So Leif touched on a lot of points there. I'm going to try and go through a couple of those. So, first of all, you mentioned having an overlap with other disorders. You mentioned anxiety disorder. Anxiety disorder is also incredibly common, and I would assume a lot of people in this room are also skeptical of whether anxiety disorder is actually a disorder at all. High neuroticism, you mentioned, well, this is a personality trait, not a disorder. Is it a useful personality trait? Maybe not, but it's still a personality trait, not a disorder. And I think this sort of points to one of my preempting points here. Leif will imply that depression is maladaptive, and I agree. I think a lot of depression, probably most depression right now, is maladaptive. But I think this misses the point. Maladaptation in the present does not imply that the machine is dysfunctional. So an obvious example would be if I jump in water and I am underwater, my lungs cannot function. They are not adaptive at all underwater. But my lungs aren't dysfunctional. They are just severely mismatched with the environment. And this isn't just some mere academic distinction. I'm not trying to sit here as a philosopher, though I am, with a little got you of, aha, we're talking about something subtly different here. We are, but I think it's very important, because when we're talking about things as disorders, things as diseases, taking this dysfunction model where it fails to do what it was selected to and in the ancestral past is a fairly well-entrenched theory that, though it has its criticisms, has also had a lot of defense. which I don't have time to go through, but I will go through why the adaptive model is really quite problematic, which is there are a bunch of different things in the world that make a certain trait less adaptive. And if we take that as the benchmark for disorder or disease, we end up over-generating diseases massively. So to use two examples with something like skin color, I have incredibly pale skin. If I go to some equatorial place, I will burn incredibly quickly. This is not adaptive. However, there is nothing dysfunctional about my skin color. In a much sort of darker turn in the history of humanity and even presently, people are at a fitness disadvantage because of the color of their skin. Racism is prevalent in lots of different places, and it is, in one sense, maladaptive to be, say, black in antebellum America because these people were seen as subhuman. However, there is clearly, these people do not suffer from a skin disorder. These people do not have skin dysfunction. They are maladapted to an environment that is prejudiced against them, but this is not qualifying for disease. And a lot of what Leif says here about depression, I see in a very similar way, which is, yes, these people are suffering, and absolutely, I would not want to say that people with depression should not be seen by medical professionals. I wouldn't say that we shouldn't treat them. I think they're suffering and these people should be looked after. But just because they are suffering from a particular output of a system does not mean that that system is dysfunctional, even if the output is not helpful in the present. And with 40 seconds, I will just say one other thing when this computer behaves. Yes, you mentioned treating it and it being a treatable disorder, but why does it have to be a disorder for us to try and treat it? We treat pain all of the time well, I don't, I'm a philosopher, but people, the useful doctors treat pain all of the time. People come to the doctors with a dysfunction, say like a broken leg, but then they also prescribe a painkiller because they know what it does and they can block these functional signals in a way that is not deleterious to health. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Leif, you have your rebuttal against James.
Right. So autoimmune disorder also does what it's supposed to be doing in the way that on its own it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's just doing it to the detriment of the organism it's doing it to instead of for the benefit. So sometimes things can misfire. If we consider that most cases of depression, or if we are even more statistically specific and say most depression, which is actually the recurrent disorder and the chronic disorder, they are then sending signal and being maintained and reducing psychosocial function and causing more pain and suffering. And at that point, you have to ask the question, what is the function really achieving? What is it? Is it still firing based upon input? It isn't. Is it still doing something that it ought to be doing in such a manner that it's doing it well? Well, it isn't. So at least one of your criteria is being breached. And I think at that point, one needs to just step back and say, nah, it isn't. I understand this. There's something about, it's something about what we need to know about the function of sadness. We need to know about the function of low mood from an evolutionary perspective. And I think that's where our common ground lies. But when it comes to trying to defend the idea that most depression in the world is a functioning system, when most of it is being elicited without any events that one can identify, and it's to the detriment of the organism in their situation and life, and when one hasn't even specified what the function actually is, that means that we're black boxing the whole situation. We don't know what the positive output should be. We don't know what it really was supposed to be doing, but we're claiming that it is functional. And I feel that we're just clinging to that because we want to be evolutionists. But that's not necessary. Let it go. What we need to do is understand what is the function of sadness? And one of the questions that I really would love to have the answer to, because we know what happens to people who don't have anxiety. So mainly they are male, and mainly they end up dead. So what happens to people who don't have sadness? There is no good study of that. We don't really know what these people look like. And we don't know what is the detrimental effect of not having sadness. Hypo, low mood. Also, one of the features of adaptive responses is its transient, reactive response and nature. Depression lasts for 2 weeks, yes. Most of the episodes last for 3 months. But when it goes 2 years chronically, and it's still going to continue, there is nothing adaptive about it anymore. The difference between anxiety and fear is the fear you feel when you're almost hit by the bus, and the anxiety of everything you can imagine going wrong in your life while you make the horror movie in your mind is not adaptive.
Okay. Great, thank you. So we now have the sort of chaired discussion round. I'm going to take the privilege to kind of raise some points here. We'll start this. Okay, so the name of the debate is most depression is a functional signal. I'm wondering, James, that there is this presentness in the is. This is like right now it is a functional signal. You've mostly made the argument that depression probably has some kind of functional root, and I think Leif probably sort of agrees with that. But the question is posed as, is most depression today currently a functional signal? Do you think that's plausible? And if so, what is the function? Can you be specific about that?
Yeah, so it depends how, again, if Leif is spelling this out, is in most cases depression adaptive? Are they functional in this non-evolutionary sense where are they useful for present-day life? I would say no, probably not. I would also say this applies to pretty much every affective state we have, though. Affective systems work on a smoke detector principle. They have more misfires than they have accurate firings because it's evolutionarily beneficial. So the fact that most signals from most affective systems aren't useful is not good reason to think that the system is dysfunctional. And because we've framed this as a functional signal, I'm taking functional signal to mean the output of a properly functioning, in an evolutionary sense, because that's what we're here for, system. And in that case, yes, I think that even presently, the system is properly functioning, and therefore the output is a functional signal in this respect, even if it's not a useful signal in a more like folksy sense. What do I think the function of sadness or low mood is? I think it's to limit resource expenditure in unpropitious circumstances. So when you're more likely to use resources such as energy, or you're going to like break social bonds that are not worth the gains that you make, whether they're more resources, social bonds, whatever, think very generally, low mood kicks in to demotivate behavior. That's the quick and dirty version.
Okay. And Leif, you are arguing that the outcomes for most depressed people are like quite dysfunctional. What's your position on whether it's like a functional signal causing dysfunctional outcomes, or do you just think it's actually a dysfunctional, like the system is going wrong in some way, it's manifesting in a way which was never evolutionarily relevant or never increased reproductive success evolutionarily? What's your position on how functional the internal mechanism is?
Yeah, so I think mental time travel is absolutely a good function. We can go back in the past and consider our mistakes. We can go forward in the future and consider what may go wrong. But the brooding aspect is you consider your mistake, you've considered your mistake again. There is no reason to now repeat it, but there is an internal slight kick. There's this internal conditioning response where it feels meaningful. Plus, we've got ideas about our ideas. We believe that, for example, regret is helpful. It isn't. We believe worry is helpful. It isn't. We have a lot of beliefs about what we can do. One of the most fascinating things is panic disorder. I really love treating panic disorder. In Western countries, people believe it's signs of heart failure, suffocation, that they're going to faint. They can't. In North African Arab cultures, you might believe it's a jinn sitting on your chest. None of this is evolutionarily relevant. It's ideas that we've created, and we then uphold those ideas and increase those ideas based upon the feelings we have and the emotion we have. So when we're down, we feel that everything negative is meaningful, but that doesn't make it adaptive or mean that the system is adaptive. But looking at the underpinnings, what is sadness? What does sadness do? And what does failure to feel sadness do to us? I think these are the evolutionary psychopathology questions that we need answering.
Mm. So, James, you have kind of pointed out that the functional signal can be overactivated. You mentioned the smoke alarm angle. I think that everyone, well, it depends on exactly how you define function, but you would say that when the smoke alarm is going off, but actually there is no fire, then it's not actually being functional at that point. It's doing its job, but part of the system is built to kind of cause bad things, right? To cause harm, to actually just, it manifests in something which is just annoying in the case of the smoke alarm, and perhaps also for depression. So and then the question is phrased as most depression is a functional signal. So if most of the depression that we see is actually the smoke alarm misfiring and not protecting us from fire, then it's like, it's a bit of a stretch to say it's actually functional in itself.
Okay, so is the signal functional insofar as is it useful? No. But again, I'm taking functional signal to mean the output of a properly functioning system. And like you said, the smoke alarm is doing its job. You know, the signal is doing what it's supposed to do. It's going off when there is a small bit of deodorant in there, you know, anything that sort of blocks the alpha detector. So yeah, no, is the signal useful in and of itself? No. Is the smoke alarm properly functioning, and is it sending out what it should do according to its, in this case, actual design? Then yes, and I think the same applies to depression. This is why I wanted to begin with defining terms and why philosophers love this kind of thing, because of course the word function does have multiple meanings across, you know, different fields and just in everyday life. A dysfunctional family is a different kind of thing from a dysfunctional in an evolutionary sense system. But because we are the evolutionary group here, this is why I'm taking this sort of hardline evolutionary approach to what counts as dysfunction, even in this.
Okay, interesting. I think this is like an interesting point to raise to the jury, which is that the definition of function here might not be your own definition of function. If both sides seem to be agreeing that actually most cases of depression are either the smoke alarm misfiring and not actually serving you in life. I mean, maybe you have comments on that, and maybe you disagree with that. But it's an interesting point. So Leif, yeah, do you have any, are you going to push on this front anymore?
Yeah, because I think one of the important aspects there is we have people who are depressed who aren't experiencing anything that's eliciting it. And most depression in the world, measured by most depression, just where is it happening, is the chronic and the recurrent with the non-elicited versions. And I have to arrest you that your claim is wrong. 80% of depression is not elicited by a known negative life event. So at that point, is one of your criteria for function or dysfunction out of play?
I think I'm also going to make one last comment, which is that most is imprecisely defined here, but it could be taken to mean most cases, as in the population. If you have a case of depression, everyone who has a case of depression counts as one case, or it could be taken to mean the most amount of time spent in depression, which is going to be the chronic cases, which are not relapsing. Like most cases of depression are quite short, most time spent being depressed is actually carried by a minority of people who maybe don't fit this functional signal category so far. So both most and functional.
What I was going to say.
Okay, yeah. So now I'm going to open it up for the audience clarifiers. Can I have a volunteer to take this microphone around? Tonight will do it. Thank you. Please do wait for the microphone. I am going to ask for like very short comments. Please make it like snappy. We have a limit of time. Later there will be a discussion session where you can put forward your own points, but I really want you to be targeting our speakers here with specific questions. So questions, not comments, is my request. There are comments later. We have a whole another session for comments. Please, if you have anything like short to say. Okay, I'm going to start the timer. Cos, please.
Thanks. So I've got a question for Leif, and I'd like you to clarify how these two aspects fit into the argument that you're making. Firstly, is there a dysfunctional predisposition, even if someone isn't depressed, that is causing their system in the future to become, quote unquote, dysfunctional? And secondly, this brooding, this rumination, is it best to consider it as a kind of self-perpetuating doom loop that isn't allowing someone to escape it, which means that it can't be functional in that sense?
To the latter, absolutely yes, and the first got lost in me considering the latter. So what was the first?
The first point was about predisposition. So can one think about depression as being a dysfunctional predisposition that can manifest later on, even if the exact manifestation can be considered functional?
Yeah, so there's genetic predispositions, there are neurotic predispositions, there is the disposition of actually spending a lot of time in your mind pondering and ruminating and brooding and worrying and regretting and all of this in a life processing. So I think in our societies we have predisposing factors even in our climate of psychotherapy, where we want people to body check, consider how you're feeling. How are you? I keep answering it. If people ask me, how are you? I'm going to answer it. It's not a greeting, it's a question. So if people don't want me to answer, don't ask me. But you shouldn't be doing it to yourself either every time you get out of bed. How am I feeling today? Oh, is this a bad day? So these kinds of states and predispositions increase the likelihood of getting into the doom loop.
James, do you have anything to say to that before the next question?
No.
Okay. Riyad, please.
Is it worth making a distinction between first episode, depression, and recurrent and chronic depression? So that's my first. Both parties. This is, my question is relevant to the issue of mismatch, and I just want to add here that Ben Costa and I have written a paper on two types of mismatch, which is functional trait mismatch and dysfunctional trait mismatch. So with the functional trait mismatches, the system is functioning as it evolved to do, as it was selected to do, whereas with the dysfunctional trait mismatch, the system becomes damaged and produces dysfunctional effects. So is that what is going on, do you think, with the recurrent and chronic depression?
So there are two parts to that. The first is the recurrent versus chronic. Should we be distinguishing it? The second was on his point about mismatch and what type of mismatch we're thinking about.
Yeah, so I think sort of, yes, we should distinguish between recurrent and chronic and these sort of one-off cases. However, I don't think it really is the time or the fact that it is recurrent that's the problem. Because if you have recurrent bouts of depression, but in each case, someone dies, you lose a job, all these kind of things, you'd have recurrent depression, but that's not an indicator that it's dysfunctional. However, I do think we should absolutely distinguish between, mild low mood and severe low mood that needs treatment because it gets in the way of our lives, and then those that do have good indicators of dysfunction. So just to follow up on Leif's point about the 80% thing, yeah, 80% of first cases have these precipitating conditions, and absolutely after that, the number of the cases where you have these precipitating conditions goes down. But of course, you can't have a second bout of depression without having a first bout of depression. So it's true that 80% of cases of these first bouts of people have a major negative life event. Yes, if one person then has 8 bouts of depression overall, then the number of cases of depression, Leif will be correct. However, this was my, perhaps a fault in my wording. Of the people who get depressed, 80% of those people, at least in their first instance, have a major negative life event. So I use this opportunity to clarify that point, because I think it is important, because yeah, absolutely. If you have 10 bouts of depression and at that point there's nothing, causing this, then maybe, still only a maybe, you have a dysfunction there. But yeah, go on, Leif.
Yeah, so most people with the same life events do not have a depressive episode as response. So most people go through life with a lot of negative life events and no depression. So an actual minority will, in 80% of the cases for their first episode, have a negative life event. So the life event itself is not the cause. There has to be an interaction with a susceptibility, a vulnerability. Now, when you get a negative emotional reaction, how you choose to cope with it often will decide to what degree you get a mental disorder or not. So a lot of anxiety just is in passing. Most people can have panic attacks without developing panic disorder. And when I taught my students panic disorder models and taught them how it wasn't dangerous, they weren't going to faint, they weren't going to die, it wasn't a heart attack, I had students come to me say they'd been there for a week or two in a new city, they'd had a panic attack, and they'd had another one, and they were actually starting to develop panic disorder. And then just from the infotainment in my lecture, they'd not had any more panic attacks due to that, which is, I think, a lot of the information that we're presenting in many of the CBTs for these disorders is what's helping people to choose a different outcome through how they're actually approaching their disorder. So that's it. Yes, I think to some degree we need to differ between first episode and recurrent and chronic, but I'm not sure we have that information, because I think we just put all of those into the same models. I don't know what we have of information about what is it the people who have one episode and never another episode again, what is it they do differently? I would like to know.
I think I'm going to give James a chance, / put him on the spot and ask him, why is it that if this is a kind of natural emotional state that's meant to respond to this times of lacking propitiousness, and then how do you respond to Leif's question of why is it not more common? Why is it not that everyone who goes through divorce enters depression? What's going on there?
Right. Yeah, this was on preempting points number 2. Leif will bring up the 22% point. So yeah, it's absolutely true that though in these first instances, most of these are precipitated by negative life events, most people who experience negative life events don't end up in a major depressive state. The last figure I got was about 22% of those people end up with major depression. However, if you just frame it as 22% of them experience major depression and then the rest of the people are just fine, that's not what's going on. We know that these people experience quite severe low mood. So the difference is one of a fairly arbitrary line being drawn, which is these people may experience low mood for a week and 5 days, or they might experience very prolonged mood, but they only exhibit 3 low mood symptoms. So there's massive variation in exactly the kinds of low mood. There will probably be a few people experience no low mood, and that probably is dysfunctional. So, first of all, it's not that you have this hard line of the depressed and the non-depressed. You have the people who qualify for depression, and then the people who are in a low mood that doesn't quite qualify for depression. Biological traits vary massively in terms of how susceptible people are to anything. So fear responses, pain responses, how fast your heart rate is, how tall you are, all of these things. There's massive variation. So we should expect the same here. Also, people vary massively in the amount of support they receive following these negative life events. If I lose a job and then I get a new, better job a week later, I'm probably going to get in a pretty good mood pretty quickly. But someone who doesn't isn't going to be. Also, 22%, even if this was an indicator of severity or rarity, it would be most unlike other conditions where we use a minority of people to say, right, this picks out the dysfunction. So if we did this with height, anyone underneath 5'6" would be considered to have a height dysfunction. That's about 22% of, or any male under 5'6". In terms of things like IQ, you need to be in the bottom, I think it's 2% of people to be considered as having an intellectual disability, not the 22%. So 22% is quite a big number. There's massive differences in susceptibility to any affective state. And what was the other point I made? Yeah, and in terms of support, just saying that there must be something biologically different about these people doesn't get to the whole story. There are differences in these people's lives that change the propitiousness of the
Do you
circumstance.
have a quick response? Or
I checked the numbers for the mental deficiency there. I think you can have a mental deficiency before reaching the 2%. But I think what we really are stuck on now is the question of, if it fires without being elicited, isn't one of the criteria of yours broken? And why would we want to continue fighting that issue then? The other thing is, why is it that so many of the well-to-do, thriving, safe, socioeconomically well-off young people today are showing more and more symptoms of depression? And also, why, if wasting energy with no outcome, aren't joggers more depressed?
I don't get to answer this one.
No,
Oh.
this is too. No.
I had good answers.
Okay,
You just have to believe me.
Very quickly, just like in
Okay.
what's the 15-second summary?
So yes, without the external input, fine, but you still have the proximate input, which is you believe in a bad state. The system is, if anything, it's garbage in, garbage out. Fine, you think you're in a terrible place, so the system goes, yeah, let's give you some low mood. Even if nothing terrible is happening in the world, there must be some informational link between the world and the rest of the systems in your mind. That's the answer to that.
Hi, my question's for Leif. So you associate depression with brooding,
Absolutely.
and you also said that through treatment, you're very effective at getting your patients to stop brooding.
Absolutely.
So is it not the argument that the function of the depression is to get them to stop brooding?
And in general, after 3 months, people return to normal mood without any major life events precipitating that either. And then, in general, within a year, or within 9 months actually, they likely drop back again into a new episode of depression, now without anything eliciting it. So what I say, efficient treatment has to reduce the depth of the episode, how far into the dump they go, shorten the episode, not have it last too long, and increase the time between each episode. Because in treatment research of depression, one only looks at, in most cases, one only looks at the point recurrent depression. So if you do a 1 or 2 years follow-up, you just consider how many are depressed today, but you don't consider how often have they been depressed in the time up until today. But in our follow-up study, we used several different criteria for relapse, and we followed them up for 3 years.
But the question was, the function of the depression is to elicit an outcome, which is to stop brooding. The fact that they don't stop brooding is not the same as the depression not being functional.
Who said that depression is there to stop brooding? Because I've never heard anyone say that.
No, you didn't, but you did say that the treatment was to encourage the individuals to stop brooding.
That's the treatment, yes.
Yes, so that's then a failure in the treatment, not that the depression doesn't have a function.
The treatment is... I actually don't understand now. Now I'm so lost that now I can't follow it.
You guys can follow up. This is, we're at... Sorry.
Hi. I have a completely different angle, and it's about the immune system. So we know there is a lot of evidence now that if we have increased inflammation, induce even experimental, we can induce depression symptoms in animal experiment. And we, the other way around of giving anti-inflammatory treatment to depressed patients and so on. So I guess you're familiar with that. So where the immune system comes, how it supports or not your...
You both have 15 seconds.
So if you have signals from the immune system, which are detected mostly by interoception, if you have massive spikes in inflammation, it's a sign of disease. If the function of low mood was to demotivate behavior in unpropitious circumstances, having a disease is an unpropitious circumstance, one in which you should rest, one in which you should be demotivated, and one which you should probably be pessimistic about what you can do. So it fits the functioning I'm going.
Do you have any response?
No, at this point, I absolutely agree with what you've said. That is absolutely fair. And I think one of the problems that we have in this discussion is we're talking about sadness and depression, and I like the term low mood system because that covers it all, but it's larger, isn't it? It is demotivational system or other words that we could use, because we haven't even done that. We haven't even tried to carve nature at its joints to see what different aspects do we have here. So we've got 7 or 8 different anxiety disorders and just one mood disorder. That's odd in itself.
Okay, thank you very much. We are now coming on to the closing statement. So you each have 4 minutes to either make your best statement about your point or destroy the other person's point of view. I'm starting with, I think we'll start again with James on the closing statement, please.
Okay, so I have prepared something for this, and with all the sort of back and forth, I think I'll just go for this because I don't want us to lose the wood for the trees. There's been sort of many moving parts here, I'll just sort of appeal to your intuitions to finish. So suppose I'm right. Suppose that something like 80% of cases of depression are functional signals in this specific evolutionary way I've defined it. This would still imply that around 1 in 100 people have dysfunctional mood systems. Dysfunctional not because of some pathogen or brain injury, but by mere chance. Perhaps something in the environment happens that causes a mental dysfunction, something like this. But, we don't have these identifiable pathogens, brain injuries, except for a minority of cases. Does it not seem strange that evolution would have endowed us with minds that are this susceptible to dysfunction via things that would have happened in our ancestral environments all the time, things like death of a loved one, falling out with conspecifics, not having enough resources. Even 1 in 100 seems like quite a high number for such susceptibility to such recurrent evolutionary problems to actually cause dysfunction. Then consider that according to this sort of mainstream psychiatric position, it's about 4 or 5 times as many people as this who have this susceptibility. This, just as a background, does not seem so likely to me. It does not seem likely that about 4% of the world's population have a mind that is so susceptible to dysfunction merely because recurrent ancestral problems have happened. It seems much more likely that these are functional responses to those recurrent problems. Now, does depression get in the way of people's lives? Of course. Is it unpleasant? Absolutely. Should we care for people suffering from it? Yes. Does any of this mean that it is a dysfunction? No. Mild low mood gets in the way of our lives, is unpleasant, and we should care for those in a low mood. The same applies to pain, worry, anxiousness, and a whole host of other negative affective states, none of which are dysfunctional. So let me offer an alternative proposal that we have touched on, and Adam actually touched on in his opening talk, and Riyad mentioned as well. While most cases of depression might not be dysfunctional, this does not mean that they're not mismatched with present environments. I'm just going to give you an example that I think is really nice to exemplify mismatch again, which is, you've probably all heard this, but in the 1800s, there were two types of peppered moths. There was a light moth and a dark moth. And as industry grew and houses became covered in soot, the dark moth population grew and the light moth population shrank because dark moths became camouflaged against the houses and the trees. But there was nothing dysfunctional about the light moth's pigmentation or the systems that generated that pigmentation. It was doing exactly as evolution intended. Nothing in their biology had failed. There was no dysfunction. That they were severely mismatched to their environment, and it was bad for them. And, you know, if there were you know, moth doctors and moths that could look after these other moths, they should have done so. Alas, they were moths. So just as my skin is mismatched to equatorial sunlight, our stomachs are mismatched to modern ultra-processed food, or functional lungs are mismatched to extracting oxygen from water, it seems to me that our low mood systems are in a similar state. Our low mood systems were attuned to a world without 9-to-5 jobs, built-up metropolitan areas, debt, social media, or a constant stream of news driven by the motto, if it bleeds, it leads. Our mood systems aren't particularly useful in modern times, but this does not mean that the machine is broken.
Okay. Thank you very much. And Leif, your 4 minutes, please.
Right. So we've had a whole debate about how it's functional with no arguments for the function really being argued or evidence of function provided. I think that's odd. And I really, really think that one of the things we need to do in the future is discover what is the function of sadness, what is the function of low mood, how is it evolved to do something specific in the first place. And if you ask me, what's the function of disgust? I know. What's the function of fear? I know. How do I know that OCD is dysfunctional? Well, I've treated a few patients. Believe me, it's dysfunctional. How do I know that anxiety is dysfunctional? Believe me, it's dysfunctional. It's building upon much of the same apparatus. The underpinnings are functional, and that's where we've got to put the emphasis. We mustn't take the state and say, because some of the underpinnings are working the way they ought to be working, therefore the state itself is functional. That isn't how our logic usually works. Also, the moths were dysfunctional because the less camouflaged they were, the point of the camouflage isn't a value-laden question, it's a survival question. If the birdies eat the moths when they are visible, their pattern of camouflage is dysfunctional. So the example in the end wasn't even coherent. I think it's important for us as evolutionists to be able to debate function. Then we have to have a clear definition of that function. And the fallback of mismatch is dangerous. Yes, we're all living in the zoo, but most of the zoo we brought with us, and it consists of other people. So it's not a necessary case that we mostly are mismatched. But I do think certain aspects of depressive symptoms are mismatched. For example, social withdrawal. I think it is harder today than it was 20 years ago. I think it's harder 20 years ago than it was 100 years ago. I think it's harder in many cultures in the world than in Northern Europe. I think a lot of GPs are making mistakes in giving people sick leave when they are depressed. They should be giving them jogging sessions and and social activities. So I think the way society is addressing depression and how the depressed, shall we say, the first grinding of the brooding isn't giving us a response from our societies that are making it problem-solving behaviors. So I think there's stuff in the mismatch that we should be considering, but I also feel that it's a little cop-out to continuously use it's mismatched and therefore it's really working. I don't think it is working. If the inputs from society are giving it the wrong effect and it's maintaining its output of withdrawal and brooding and not moving on, then it's not working. So we've got an apparatus that is either hypersensitive, overreacting, it is not being elicited by negative events anymore, and a lot of the features that James claimed had to be in place for it to be a function, or that couldn't be there if it was a dysfunction, I'm afraid some of them are missing.
Okay, thank you for that closing statement. Now, the big moment.